Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Nutshell presentation. If this is your first time joining us, we're so excited to have you. My name is Katie Adams, and I am the Research and Demonstration Farm Manager here at the Savanna Institute. Before we get rolling tonight, I'd love to tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. We're a nonprofit organization based out of Wisconsin and Illinois, focused on agroforestry research and education. We truly believe that widespread agroforestry can help restore ecosystems, build resilience, and support strong economies of cooperation between farmers, researchers, and perennial industry builders. We do this work through a variety of avenues. We host on-farm field days and online presentations and trainings. We offer print resources focused on key agroforestry practices, land access, and lease structures, as well as the basics of establishing tree crops. And all of these are available for free on our website. We're also building a network of demonstration farms across central Illinois and southern Wisconsin, and we're excited to have our first agroforestry apprenticeship cohort who are joining us on this call tonight. The Savanna Institute also hosts the Perennial Farm Gathering, which is each December. This year's event will be in the Sinsinawa Mound Center near Dubuque, Iowa on December 6th and 7th. We would love to have you for this phenomenal celebration of all things perennial agriculture. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Hegner Family Foundation and North Central Fair. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring you these discussions for free. During this evening's discussion, if you're joining us from your computer, I want to invite you to share your questions and comments down in the chat box here on the platform, and we will monitor them throughout the nutshell. And I will make sure to address every single question during the Q&A session at the end of Kate's presentation. If you're joining us by phone, I'll give instructions on how to ask a question at the very end as well. So, without further ado, now it's on to the main event. We are so honored to welcome our presenter for the evening, Kate MacFarland of the USDA National Agroforestry Center. Kate has worked in a wide range of positions in agriculture and natural resources, including working on managing diversified vegetable farms in New England. She is currently the Assistant Agroforester at the USDA National Agroforestry Center. I am so excited to have you present this phenomenal information for us here tonight, Kate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to her to get things started. So bear with us 1 second while I switch over the presenter. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much for the introduction. Can you hear everything okay and see it?
Everything's coming clear on our end.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Well, I'm excited to talk with all of you tonight about USDA and how it thinks about agroforestry. As you know, the title indicates, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 5 most common agroforestry practices in the U.S. So alley cropping, forest farming, riparian forest buffers, silvopasture, and windbreak. I'm going to share a little bit of information about all of these practices. Obviously, in a short presentation, we can't go into a lot of detail, but hopefully it can sort of get you thinking both about the practices a little bit more and then also just understanding a little bit more how we sort of come at them through USDA. So here's an outline for my presentation.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your end.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I'm just going to see if there's anything I can do to fix this. Okay, try that now.
Does it sound any better? Should I just go ahead? Well, I'll just start presenting and let me know if it are hearing that feedback again. So in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about sort of what I'm thinking about in terms of the USDA perspective, give a definition that we use for agroforestry, and then talk through these 5 practices, sharing the USDA definitions, what kinds of resource concerns they're designed to address, and some benefits and challenges for each of these practices, as well as how different operations are able to incorporate them into their system. Oh, sorry. So when we talk about sharing a USDA perspective, I guess I just wanted to share that I'm coming at it from a very small piece of USDA. As Katie said in her introduction, I'm part of the National Agroforestry Center. This is the staff of the Agroforestry Center. We're a relatively small group, and we are a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. We do both research as well as sort of outreach and education work. And that's what I do in my job is focus on that outreach and education. But because we're such a small team, we all really work together. Our areas of focus are looking at ecosystem services provided by agroforestry, understanding human dimensions of agroforestry, and promoting agroforestry education networks and support. I wanted to put that in the context of the broader USDA. So when I have the title of a USDA perspective, I'm really just sharing it from my perspective. So here's an org chart for the entire USDA, and you can see the secretary up top and then all of these different offices and agencies that fall under these different divisions within USDA. I'm a U.S. Forest Service employee, so one small agency within this, and as I mentioned, the National Agroforestry Center is a partnership with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So when I share this USDA perspective on agroforestry practices, it's really coming from my role at the Forest Service as well as what I know due to all of our work with our Natural Resource Conservation Service partners. I thought I'd also mention that part of our work at the National Agroforestry Center is working with a broader interagency agroforestry team that includes staff from the Agricultural Marketing Service, Farm Service Agency, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, Economic Research Service, National Ag-Specific Service, and the Ag Research Service, as well as others, to try and further agroforestry opportunities within those agencies and their programs as well. But again, even if you look across those agencies, it's not comprehensive of all of USDA. So I just wanted to share that because I think, you know, the USDA has tens of thousands of employees, and I'm just one, and NAC is just a few of those employees. So I'll be sharing from those perspectives. So what is agroforestry? There's a lot of definitions out there, but the one that we use at the National Agroforestry Center and the one that's included in the USDA Agroforestry Strategic Framework is this one. So agroforestry is the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into crop and animal farming systems to create environmental, economic, and social benefits. So I think some of the key words to look at there is the intentional integration. So it's not just that trees and crops or trees and animals happen to be next to each other. It's really designed that way. And I think, as we'll talk about as we go through the different practices, you can design your agroforestry practices and your farm operation to have whatever suite of environmental, economic, and social benefits you're looking for. So those are some of the key things to pull out of this particular definition of agroforestry. But when you think about all the different ways of integrating trees and shrubs into crop and animal farming systems, that's amazingly diverse, right? We know that there are so many different kinds of crop and animal farming systems out there, and then you add in forestry, and really, you know, there is no limit in the different ways that you can combine all of these systems. So you can think about all these different combinations of crops and trees and livestock, and there's a lot of different systems and agroforestry practices that you can imagine in there. And those are all extremely exciting. It is so interesting to learn both globally and in the U.S. and in other temperate areas, the different ways that people are combining agroforestry. And it's really exciting and important to recognize the huge variety of practices that are out there. And that's really exciting. But we're going to talk about these 5 practices today, in part because, so one reason is because they're the ones that are most common. When we look around the U.S. and see how people are practicing agroforestry, you know, we see riparian forest buffers probably most frequently. We also see a lot of windbreaks and shelter belts. We see some people practicing silvopasture, some people practicing alley cropping, and some people doing different arrangements of multi-story cropping and forest farming. Again, these aren't meant to be, you know, trying to describe all the practices that are out there or say that agroforestry is only these 5 practices, but they are the ones that we see most often. So again, I was asked to give a presentation on these 5 practices, and a lot of the time people will call them, the USDA practices, which is true in that the USDA offers assistance through its conservation programs related to these particular practices. And out of that, or because of that, they've developed conservation practice standards related to each of these agroforestry practices. And developing those practice standards was the work of efforts by farmers, state agencies, nonprofits, and many others in partnership with NRCS staff. They work together to develop, test, and demonstrate the conservation benefits of these different agroforestry practices. And again, this list of practices that I have up here isn't meant to be a definitive list of the only things that USDA would ever consider agroforestry. There could definitely be more eventually added to this list. And I think it's important to realize that these were added in different years in response to different needs after they were demonstrated at usually a state level. So these are national standards now, but they were originally developed at a more local level. Another thing I wanted to mention is that although these practice standards are developed within the Natural Resource Conservation Service, many other agencies like state agencies and also other kinds of organizations that are doing work in conservation and agriculture and agroforestry use these practice standards, or at least use them as a baseline standard when they're working through their programs on supporting agroforestry. So they're important to understand for that reason as well. Even if you're not working with USDA, you may be working with some other either state agency or other program that would be referencing that standard. The links that I have on there, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is to the or the online electronic field office technical guide, which I'll be talking through later on, some of the documents included there, which just gives all of the details of what these conservation practice standards look like. And I also have a link on this slide to a map that we have on our National Agroforestry Center webpage that shows which states offer which agroforestry-related practices. And I can share those later on if it's helpful. I guess I mentioned briefly about that sort of history of developing these particular practice standards, and I thought I'd quickly mention, if you are interested in learning more, a few years ago, Bruce White, who was the NRCS agroforester at the National Agroforestry Center and was later the National Forester for NRCS, he's since retired, but he and I worked together a few years ago to sort of share a little bit of that history about developing the technical standards for agroforestry, and that was included in one of our newsletters. So I thought I'd start out, I am going to get into the sort of details of the practices, but I thought it was worth sharing a little bit more about my thinking and our thinking at the National Agroforestry Center about why do we talk about agroforestry in terms of practices? Why do these definitions matter when, you can combine trees and crops and trees and livestock and trees and crops and livestock in so many different ways. I know, when I get to talk to farmers and see how people are using trees in their operation, there's a huge amount of variety and adaptation of these practices to their particular operation based on their own needs and skills, their farm and the ecological conditions at their farm, what their local markets are, and so many other conditions. It's really rare that I see well, maybe not. There are plenty of times that I see farms where they're doing amazing agroforestry that wouldn't fall squarely in these 5 practices. But at the same time, we need to use some sort of shorthand to talk to one another. By using terms like silvopasture and windbreaks and riparian buffers, it's a useful shorthand so that we don't have to describe in detail what's going on your farm every time you bring it up. So these definitions aren't intended to be comprehensive or say you can't do things outside of them, but it's meant to be this common language so that when person's talking about a windbreak, they have a regional sense of what that person's saying. They're also really important in terms of USDA programs, and I'm not going to talk in detail about what those programs are. Last year, Rich Straight, my colleague at NAC, gave a nutshell presentation for the Savanna Institute on agroforestry and USDA programs, and that has some more detail on sort of how we see agroforestry fitting into this wide array of USDA programs that don't often mention agroforestry explicitly, but can support and be relevant to work in agroforestry. But I think it's important to think about these definitions and why USDA has definitions for these practices in the context of those programs as well. Because when we're talking about that USDA context, we're inherently talking about public dollars supporting agroforestry. You know, a lot of the time that may be through technical assistance. So if somebody from NRCS or FSA or the Forest Service is working with you to help you design an agroforestry system or just share their research or share their ideas, you know, we are all lucky enough to be supported through public dollars. And so that means when we talk about and when we provide either technical assistance or financial assistance to farms and farmers and other kinds of producers, we need to have some standard that we're working towards. We need to have some expectation of what those public dollars are doing. In particular, I think when we're thinking about conservation title public dollars that support these agroforestry practices, it's really important that those practices are achieving their intended conservation purposes. So NRCS categorizes its conservation purposes into major resource concerns of soil, air, water, plants, animals, and energy. But I think as we think through these questions of what is a definition for a specific agroforestry practice, what are the purposes, and then, you know, what are the benefits and how do they fit into different kinds of systems on farms, that's sort of why we're tying it back to this resource concern piece, is because if you're coming at it from a USDA perspective, at least through the conservation programs, you need to have that public benefit, that natural resources benefit. So that can be one of the challenging aspects of agroforestry that I love, but is also sort of hard to wrap our heads around, is that these agroforestry practices both are production practices and conservation practices. I'm not trying to say that agroforestry practices are some silver bullet or do it all. Every system needs to be designed specifically to meet the goals of the producer. And like you can't design every system to meet every goal. It can't do every production goal and every conservation goal. But I think one of the challenges when we talk about this idea of productive conservation is that a lot of the support for agroforestry practices, at least in terms of establishment, comes from conservation programs. And so when we're thinking about the definitions of agroforestry practices in a USDA context, to a certain extent, we need to really be thinking about those conservation purposes. So as a result, when I sort of talk through or represent the USDA perspective, I'm going to lean on the NRCS conservation practice standards more than I do in most conversations about agroforestry. So again, these definitions are related to using programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program to establish practices, and through that program, you need to be addressing one or more, they call them resource concerns or conservation needs or conservation problems. Your design or your purpose for having an agroforestry practice might look different if you were designing entirely focused on production without that conservation benefit. I think I wanted to mention that sort of this conservation, or sorry, this production purpose is something that USDA can also support. Especially recently at the National Agroforestry Center, we've been thinking more about how we support producers who are thinking about, you know, how do we better understand and achieve economic viability of farms, so through agroforestry. So this is, you know, this production purpose is definitely a USDA perspective as well. There's a lot of other parts of sort of the production supply chain that USDA can support. So you look at agencies like the Ag Marketing Service or value-added producer grants and you know, SARE programs that really think about economic viability. So I don't want to sort of misrepresent things and not acknowledge that, you know, USDA can help you in thinking about the rest of that supply chain and think about really production-oriented systems. But since I'm focused on practices today, I'm going to be talking about practice standards. And those are really most relevant to programs in sort of the conservation title of the Farm Bill. So I'm going to focus more on the resource concerns and conservation problems that agroforestry helps to address. So to discuss each practice, I'm going to use the basic outline of the conservation practice standards themselves, which I'm sort of trying to describe them through these slides because I find them a little overwhelming to look at first. So I also wanted to mention that I'm going to be using the national practice standards. So that has the section that's the definition over here up top. And then it has the purpose, the practice purpose. And these are the resource concerns that particular practice helps to address. These practice standards also include sections on where the practice should be applied. So you can see this paragraph here describes conditions where practice applies. It has a section on criteria, which is really what the practice looks like and how it should be designed. And then there's additional criteria for designing the practice for specific purposes. So this example one that I have up here, hopefully you can see it, and we'll go into more detail for this one later on, is on windbreak and shelter belt establishment. So you can see there's additional criteria to manage snow deposition or additional criteria for visual screens. So there's just more detail when you're focusing in on those specific purposes. I think one thing as we start to talk through this resource concern and purpose section, or even if you start to look at these additional criteria for specific purposes, I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk through all these practices that it's not possible to design, one agroforestry practice to meet every purpose. A lot of the research that's been done at the National Agroforestry Center over the years has focused on how design of agroforestry practices really matters in how effective they are. And there are trade-offs in function between designing for one purpose and another purpose. And it's really impossible to design to maximize all of them at once. So just as we talk through all the amazing functions that agroforestry practices can have, keep in mind that one system can't do it all, one practice can't do it all. So just giving a little more information and background on these conservation practice standards. They also have information on other considerations and some information on management, on operation and maintenance, not a lot of detail there most of the time. And so that's sort of the format and design of the conservation practice standards. I think it's also important to keep in mind that, so these are the national standards. Each state that offers these agroforestry-related conservation practices also has a state-specific version of this standard that addresses considerations that may exist at a more local level, like species recommendations or spacing or other ecologically appropriate specifics. And these practice standards, along with the practice overviews, job sheets, and other materials on the national website, as well as on each site's field office technical guide, provide a good background on the purposes and how they're applied. So I'd suggest looking at those, particularly if you want to sort of work with USDA or apply for financial assistance for establishing the practices. So with that very long preamble, I'm going to start to walk through the 5 most common agroforestry practices in this presentation. I'll include the NRCS definition and the NRCS purposes, but I'm also going to talk more generally about the benefits and challenges that producers see related to each practice and provide some examples of how people incorporate these practices into their operations, just to help you picture it. Obviously, in this short presentation, it's not going to be comprehensive. I'm sort of talking very generically, not about a specific region or a specific type of operation and how they incorporate these practices, but I'm hoping this is effective at giving an overview. So again, I'm going to talk about these 5 most common temperate agroforestry practices of silvopasture, windbreaks, riparian buffers, alley cropping, and forest farming or multi-story cropping. There's sort of two names for that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I'm going to start out with riparian forest buffers. The definition that NRCS gives is an area, predominantly trees or shrubs, located adjacent to and upgradient from water courses or water bodies. And for each of these practices, I've included the link to the National Conservation Practice Standard at the bottom of the definition page. So on that Conservation Practice Standard for riparian forest buffers, these are the purposes that are listed. So creating shade to lower or maintain water temperatures to improve habitat for aquatic organisms, create or improve riparian habitat and provide a source of detritus and large woody debris. The one that we talk about sort of most often when we talk about riparian forest buffers, reducing excess amounts of sediment, organic material, nutrients, and pesticides in surface runoff, and reduce excess nutrients and other chemicals in shallow groundwater flow. So I'm not going to read through every practice each time, but you can see these are the resource concerns that this riparian forest buffer practice is designed to address. So if you were to approach USDA and getting support for establishing a riparian buffer, you want to be trying to meet one of these resource concerns. You may have some other benefits that you're hoping to get from a riparian buffer, but these are the conservation problems that USDA says that riparian buffers help to address. So what are the benefits here? So improve water quality, that's the one that comes up again and again, and one of the reasons why there are so many different conservation programs, both at the federal level, state level, local level, for getting help and supporting riparian forest buffer establishment. Another really key one, especially in parts of the West, well, really all over, is enhancing wildlife habitat and thinking about how do we improve aquatic habitat, improve riparian corridors, all of that. Increasingly, we're seeing people use riparian forest buffers to plant income-producing crops. So people are planting species that can produce fruit or nuts. They're planning ahead and thinking about timber production from their riparian forest buffer, especially if you're making it much wider than the typical riparian forest buffer. And people are also thinking about how do we use riparian forest buffers for flood protection and for protecting stream banks. I also want to talk through some of the challenges here for each of the practices, because I think it's really easy for us to think about all of the benefits that come from agroforestry, but I think it's really important to think too about sort of the trade-offs there. So as is true of most agroforestry practices, unless you're designing them explicitly to be that diversified crop, produce some sort of income, a lot of the time when you're adding in a riparian forest buffer, you're taking land out of existing crop or livestock production. One of the challenges that a lot of riparian forest buffers have created is being, especially if they're not particularly managed, is being a space where invasive species can take over. Another challenge if you're trying to achieve some of those purposes that are outlined, a lot of the research that's been done at the National Agroforestry Center has shown that the location of the riparian forest buffer in the landscape and how that buffer is designed, how wide it is, what kind of species you're using, and how you're managing it really matters in achieving those goals, especially those goals around water quality. And sometimes establishing it is hard. So if you're dealing with frequent flooding, if you're dealing with wildlife concerns, it can be really hard to get that buffer established in the first place. So just challenges to be aware of up front as you're thinking about putting it together. So how can you use it? So we see people putting them on the edge of fields and pastures, really designing for wildlife, designing for water quality, designing for harvesting crops or bioenergy crops, or designing it for recreation. These aren't all mutually exclusive, but you probably couldn't design for all of them at once. So I just wanted to sort of help people think through how they might fit into their farms. So next I'll talk about windbreak establishment. So the definition that NRCS uses is windbreaks or shelter belts are single or multiple rows of trees or shrubs in linear configurations. So NRCS has quite a long list of different purposes for windbreak establishment. The classic ones that we think of, like coming out of the Dust Bowl, and certainly today as well, is that need for reducing soil erosion from wind and protecting plants from that wind-related damage. We know that windbreaks also alter the microenvironment and to enhance plant growth. But we also see people using windbreaks for managing snow, providing shelter, around homes and farmsteads. Again, providing some wildlife habitat. We've been seeing some exciting work around providing noise screens and visual screens, ways to improve air quality. Improving irrigation efficiency is a really key use of windbreaks in many parts of the country. So these are all the purposes that NRCS says you can establish windbreaks for. When I think about benefits, obviously these benefits and purposes are sort of interrelated. So people put them in there to increase their crop yields, to shelter their livestock, reduce soil erosion, reduce pesticide drift, manage sow, mitigate odors and dust, provide beneficial insect habitat, and then again, that one of growing additional crops. So thinking about what are the species that you're planting into your windbreak that you can also harvest. So you get that conservation benefit of reduced soil erosion, for example, but you're also going to be harvesting a crop. When I think about the challenges of windbreak establishment, that question again is you're taking land out of crop or out of livestock production to plant those trees. With windbreaks, we know that you have, especially for row crops, you're going to have that yield benefit. You're going to be creating that microclimate that's actually beneficial to yield, but there's still the perception and the amount of land that's coming out of crop production. They can be, although they can have benefits to irrigation efficiency, sometimes if you're designing an irrigation system, there can be conflicts with the windbreak that you're trying to establish or the windbreak that's there. Like all sort of tree-based systems, there's going to be a longer time horizon. Herbicide application can be complex because you've got these perennial crops that are there. And another challenge to windbreaks is that design matters. Again, you can't sort of optimize for everything, and you need to be thinking about, you really have to have a good design and work, and if you don't have that experience, work with somebody who's good at designing windbreaks to achieve your goal. So they're thinking about wind direction during the season that you need the most protection. They're thinking about how do you avoid having gaps that only accelerate the wind, and a whole variety of other factors. But I just think for windbreaks in particular, I mean, for all agroforestry practices, design matters, but you can create major problems if you don't have good windbreak design. When we see how people are integrating windbreaks into their operations, we see a lot of different ways that those are getting integrated. So again, people are trying to make them multifunctional or income producing and harvest crops from windbreaks. We're seeing people use them as living snow fences to sort of redirect snow away from farm roads or highways, or people also use them to distribute snow over a field if you need that extra moisture at the start of the spring season. We're seeing people design them for wildlife, including pollinators and beneficial insects. We see people putting them higher in a landscape that's dealing with a lot of sediment and nutrient issues, so that they're acting as those sort of upland buffers to improve water quality. People also use them as living fences or field boundaries, and there's been some exciting work in the mid-Atlantic and probably in other places as well, where people are planting windbreaks adjacent to poultry houses to try and deal with some of the dust and odor issues there. In this discussion of windbreaks, I wanted to talk about windbreak renovation or restoration, which is another NRCS conservation practice that is offered. So the definition of restoration is replacing, releasing, and or removing selected trees and shrubs or rows within an existing windbreak or shelter belt, adding rows to windbreak or shelter belt, or removing selected tree and shrub branches. So in addition to providing assistance with establishing windbreaks, NRCS can also offer assistance in renovating or improving existing windbreak. So there's a lot of work being done on this right now across the Great Plains, and I'm happy to share more about that. But just as we talked about this windbreak establishment, I just wanted to mention that NRCS does have that other conservation practice standard for windbreak restoration. So next I'll talk about silvopasture. So NRCS's definition for silvopasture is establishment and or management of desired trees and forages on the same unit of land. So the purposes that NRCS shares, the resource concerns that silvopasture is intended to address are providing forage, shade, and or shelter for livestock, improving the health of trees and shrubs and forages, improving water quality, reducing erosion, enhancing wildlife habitat, improving biological diversity. So many of the same purposes that we've seen for some of the other practices, but really with that focus, at least for the first two purposes, on providing that forage, shade, and shelter for livestock and improving the productivity and health of trees and shrubs and forages. So what are the benefits of silvopasture? Why would you manage trees and forage and livestock together? We know there's a lot of great research around how having that shade available can reduce animal stress. And I'm not going into detail about all that research, but there's a lot out there both about heat stress, which we're talking about more now in terms of extreme weather and climate change and the need for providing shade during those very hot weeks and months, even in northern places like Vermont, where I'm sitting, or sort of the upper Midwest. There's still a need for that shade to address heat stress issues. But people also use silvopasture systems and silvopasture practices to address cold stress as well. And they do this because when you're reducing that animal stress, you're getting increased weight gain, increased milk yields, as well as other sort of animal health benefits. People also use silvopasture just to diversify their income. This is probably true of almost all the agroforestry practices, but you're getting that annual income either from your livestock or from harvesting hay, while you're waiting on that longer-term income from either timber trees or other kinds of tree crops that you're using in your silvopasture system. And then other kinds of benefits: when you're adding trees to pasture, you're having that carbon sequestration benefit. And when you're carefully and intentionally adding grazing to the woods, we're seeing people's interest in managing invasive plants and other kinds of benefits that can come from managing degraded woodlands. So what are some challenges to silvopasture? I think it's really important to talk about the fact that you need to be practicing intensive rotational grazing successfully before you use silvopasture. We talk about rotational grazing being a prerequisite to silvopasture because that's really key to not having negative impacts on the trees, whether they're getting established in a pasture or they're existing trees in the woods. Another big challenge is protecting trees from livestock. We have, tree shelters and other ways of doing this and fencing arrangements, but it's a real challenge, and it's, one of the things that comes up when silvopasture systems are less successful. Another challenge for silvopasture, and this is probably true of all the practices, but I think it's really important to talk about when we talk about silvopasture, is that you need the right site, especially when you're thinking about forest conversion to silvopasture. So there's a lot of sites that are not good for silvopasture. They're too wet. They have great tree quality. There are all these different reasons why a site might not be good for silvopasture, and I think that's important to talk about and think about as much as we're promoting the practice. And there's a lot of great resources there on sort of assessing whether a site is right for silvopasture, and I'm happy to share those. And another challenge that sometimes comes up is that, if you're doing both livestock and timber, you may get, if you're just looking at your silvopasture pasture, you may get less income from your livestock and less income from the timber, though it may be higher overall. But if you're really, your entire economic situation is focused on having optimal or maximum production of one or the other of those, you may run into challenges. So I sort of implied this earlier, but just to make it more explicit, when we think about silvopasture systems, there's sort of two routes to getting there. You can add trees to a pasture, whether that's for shade or for fodder, or using trees that produce tree crops, and you're integrating your grazing system in with those tree crops. Or you can add pasture to trees, so do that forest conversion. We see this most often in degraded woodlands, where you're using grazing and your tree management and your forage management to improve that degraded woodland. We see people using it to deal with invasive species, and we're starting to see people use it for hazardous fuels reduction as well. So next I'm going to talk about multi-story cropping. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. That issue of our newsletter does it in a little bit more detail, but we sometimes, so the practice standard is called multi-story cropping. This is the practice standard that people use when they're doing forest farming. So it's a little bit confusing sometimes that we have this practice standard called multi-story cropping, and then we talk about forest farming. So I just thought I'd put that out there, and I can give sort of more background on that if people are interested. But I'll sort of use them interchangeably, but hopefully that becomes clear. So NRCS's definition is existing or planted stands of trees or shrubs that are managed as an overstory with an understory of woody and or non-woody plants that are grown for a variety of products. So the purposes that NRCS outlines for multi-story cropping is improving crop diversity by growing mixed but compatible crops having different heights on the same area, improving soil quality by increasing utilization and cycling of nutrients, and maintaining or increasing soil organic matter, and increasing net carbon storage in plant biomass and soil. What are some of the benefits of multi-story cropping? So especially when we're talking about multi-story cropping as forest farming, there's a real benefit that comes from improving the economic value of existing forests. It helps people keep their forests as forests instead of selling them off for development. Multi-story cropping can reduce pressure on native woodland plant populations from wild harvesting. So if you're intentionally cultivating non-timber forest products or other crops under a forest canopy, there may be less demand for wild harvested populations of those crops. We see a lot of people using forest farming and multi-story cropping as a way to further diversify their farm income. So many farms in so many regions of the country have some portion of their land that's woods that they maybe aren't actively managing or aren't actively managing for an annual or shorter term income. They're only keeping it for their timber. So multi-story cropping can be a way to sort of grow a crop in the woods that exists on the farm. Sometimes multi-story cropping and forest farming can be easy to start small, and sometimes the labor that's involved can be in parts of the year that the rest of the farm is less active, so it's compelling for that reason. Sometimes it can be a good fit for absentee landowners, and it can also help with other goals that a landowner or land manager might have around forest health and biodiversity. There's also challenges there. I think some of the medicinal plants and other plants, native plants that are cultivated in the understory are less understood than many of the other crops used in agroforestry systems. There can be real challenges in finding regional seed sources for some of these crops. Some of them have a longer time horizon, and so, again, that's always something that comes up with these perennial systems and trees and shrub crops. but that's definitely a concern for some. There's some challenges in understanding the markets for forest farmed crops. I think that's something that we at NAC and many of our partners are working on, is how do we strengthen connections to those markets and make the markets a little bit more transparent, but it's definitely a challenge. And then theft is something that comes up a lot when we talk about forest farming. So having issues with people stealing the crop that's out in the woods. This is not at all meant to be comprehensive, but I wanted to talk about a few examples of different kinds of crops that are grown in forest farm systems, as well as different sort of management systems. So we see people doing log-grown mushrooms, ramps and wild leeks, different kinds of medicinals like ginseng, golden seal, cohosh, and many, many more. And then we also see people growing different kinds of decorative crops in forest farm systems. And the intensity of management, there's a huge continuum there. So some people are really, growing these crops in raised beds in the woods. Some people are doing other kinds of management techniques so that they're sort of forest farms. So they're maybe spreading seed intentionally or transplanting or doing that kind of thing. And then some, there's sort of a less intense version of forest farming or multi-story cropping that's, called wild simulated sometimes, where you're maybe removing invasives but not doing much more than that. So just mentioning for that one the sort of wide range of management that exists. So last I'll talk about alley cropping. So the definition from NRCS is trees or shrubs are planted in sets of single or multiple rows with agronomic horticultural crops or forages produced in the alleys between the sets of woody plants that produce additional products. So, sort of like windbreaks, there's a wide array of purposes that are offered for alley cropping, enhancing microclimatic conditions to improve crop or forage quality and quantity. So that one's pretty similar to alley cropping. The same water quality concerns that people look to other practices for, improvements to soil health, enhancing wildlife and beneficial insect habitat, increasing crop diversity. So this wide range of purposes that alley cropping can help to address. When we look at the benefits of alley cropping, it's a really clear way to diversify a farm enterprise. You can address some issues around erosion and runoff using alley cropping and improve your water quality that way. It's a great way to make a very specific microclimate for crops that sort of need certain conditions. And it's a way to improve, enhance wildlife habitat. I mentioned this a little bit on the challenges slide, but it's also a great transitional practice. So alley cropping is a way to get maximum use of your land while your trees are still small. You can see the lower photo I got from Badiga Bashaw, professor at Oregon State University, who we work with. And it's a new hazelnut orchard, and in the meantime, while the trees are growing up before they're productive, they planted strawberries between the rows. So alley cropping offers that opportunity to create income while you're waiting for your tree crop. But it requires intensive management. You have to be thinking about that competition that's going on for light or for water between the crops and the trees. I think one of the challenges with alley cropping that's exciting but kind of overwhelming is that there are so many different combinations of trees and crops that you can do, and we don't have a ton of research on, or data, I guess, on what works best together. As I mentioned, alley cropping is beneficial because it changes over time and it can be this good option while trees are small, but that also means your management has to change over time. And so what you plant in your alleyways when trees are small, and really, that alleyway crop is getting a bunch of light, you will have to swap it out for something that can handle less light as the trees get bigger. And some people just don't want to sort of change their system up that much. And then, I put this marketing one in here, and this is obviously true for many of the practices that produce tree crops, but, that a lot of people who are currently farming and have a great sense of their crop markets. When you're adding in that woody component, you're going to have to sort of get to know those markets as well, which is work. So when we look at different kinds of alley cropping systems, the sky's the limit a little bit in terms of what your tree crops can be. We see people using walnuts and pecans and chestnuts and poplars and locusts and apples and all sorts of other tree crops. Some people are interspersing those tree crops with shrubs, or they're using the alleyways to produce shrubs. You see it sort of both directions. Or in the alleyway crops, they're doing things like row crops and cereal crops, forage crops, or different kinds of specialty crops, as well as biomass. So before I finish up here, I just wanted to mention that, you know, while there are 5 conservation practice standards with sort of the agroforestry practices in their title, we know that many people have effectively used other conservation practices offered by NRCS to develop or support their agroforestry systems. So, for example, we know that people have been establishing silvopasture systems using the fencing standard 382 or tree shrub establishment 612. And so if you do look up a map and see that your state doesn't offer a particular practice, you know, there may be opportunities to get technical and financial assistance for establishing that practice using some of these sort of what we call agroforestry supporting standards. So obviously I'm not talking through all of these, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we can get really focused on whether NRCS in a particular state offers the 5 agroforestry practices, but there are, you know, in working with USDA, there's a lot of different ways to approach agroforestry. And so we're excited to talk more about that. So if you have questions now, I'm happy to answer questions, and longer term, any of us at NAC would be happy to sort of connect in the future and think more about what USDA support for agroforestry looks like.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that phenomenal presentation. I really loved how you had all of the program numbers to make it easy for folks to be able to reference those as they go through and see what might be appropriate for their farming enterprises. And just as a reminder, we'll send out this presentation as well as a link to the YouTube presentation when it's up, so you can have this access anytime you need it. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box, and if you're joining us by phone, I will open that up for phone questions as well. So Josiah is asking, I would like to do some agroforestry practices in South Texas, but have no knowledge of what tree species or practices may work. Are there references for my area?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess there are a couple ways to get references. The one most related to USDA agroforestry practices, so the topic of this presentation would be, you know, to go to your local USDA service center, or just go on, you know, navigate through the sort of maze of USDA websites, but go to the Texas Field Office Technical Guide, and that should come up if you search for that. And you can look at, you know, whichever practice you're interested in, whether it's windbreaks or alley cropping or whatever else. If you pull up the standard for Texas, there may be species recommendations for that practice. The other thing I'd really mention for Texas in particular is that the Texas Forest Service, we work with some great partners there who are excited about agroforestry, and so they would be great partners to connect with. And then finally, I don't know what part of Texas you're in, but both through, there's a group of folks called that are working together in the Great Plains Initiative to think about windbreaks in particular. And there are folks from Texas involved with that, and there's a lot of great conversations around species, and especially on the windbreak renovation side, how do we think better about species and windbreaks, as well as there's a new working group that's gotten started in the Southwest. So they're primarily folks in New Mexico and Arizona, but they're definitely working with folks in West Texas as well. And they're called the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network, or SWAN. And they're working together to sort of share information around things like species recommendations too.
Thanks, Kate. Ryan Smith asked, does the USDA expect to see much growth in agroforestry jobs in the future? If so, in what sectors do they expect to see that growth?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I am personally really interested in. A couple of years ago at the Association for Temperate Agroforestry conference, I helped moderate a panel on, I think we called it agroforestry jobs. What do you do if agroforestry isn't in the job description? Because I think this question around jobs in agroforestry is so important. So I think one key route looking at USDA is, I talked through the role of the Natural Resource Conservation Service in offering technical and financial assistance for all these agroforestry practices. If folks are interested and able to get a job with NRCS, it can be part of your job to work with producers and landowners on establishing these agroforestry practices. Obviously, that wouldn't be your entire job. You'd be working across the whole range of conservation practices, but that's one place where I think there's an opportunity for agroforestry jobs. I think another key area for agroforestry jobs that I see is people who work for nonprofits focused on a lot of the benefits that come from agroforestry. So maybe it's water quality or wildlife or economic development, and they sort of find a space for themselves in arguing agroforestry is how we get to that benefit that your organization is trying to do. And then finally, another topic that I've been interested in recently is thinking more about and learning more about how consulting foresters, crop consultants, and other kinds of consultants who work with landowners are working to support and promote agroforestry by doing that sort of one-on-one technical assistance. So that's another sort of sector where I see agroforestry jobs emerging.
I just want to jump in here and also say that we need agroforestry farmers, and there's going to be a very large turnover of land in the next 20 years. About 70% of land will be turned over, and we have a huge opportunity to train and start vibrant farm businesses with new and beginning farmers that are really focused on agroforestry.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I shouldn't have left that one out. That's sort of the most exciting and clear way to work in agroforestry is to be working in agroforestry through farming. And I'll just add to that as well that a lot of some of the programs I mentioned today, as well as some other programs, there's a real benefit if you're a new and beginning farmer. You're sometimes able to get more financial assistance or get access to different programs if you're in that situation. So I can share more about that if anyone's interested.
Joshua asked, where do we find what conservation practice standards are available in each state? Oh, and Josiah put a link, which is great.
Oh, great. Yeah. It's a little, the NRCS, the Field Office Technical Guide website can be a little bit confusing to navigate, which is one of the reasons why we created that map that's on our website that we try and update about every 6 months that tries to show it for the agroforestry practices, but there's also a link. If you click on your state, it links you to your state's Field Office Technical Guide, and we also included instructions on sort of how to navigate to Section 4, the Conservation Practice Standards. It's a little confusing, but we try to include instructions there just because we know people are looking for that.
And Joshua asks, Kate, where do we find the map that you were just talking about?
Here, I included if you go to the National Agroforestry Center website and click on the Practices tab, if you scroll to the bottom of the page, it's there. But I also have a link earlier in my presentation that I'll pull up in just a second here. So it's that second link on the bottom of the page there. But if you just go to fs.usda.gov/NAC and then click on Practices and scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a Conservation Practice Standards map link there. Great.
I have one question myself, Kate, before we wrap up, because it looks like no one joined us by phone tonight. Do you have any tips for approaching your local NRCS or conservation agent about how to start the conversation? around adding agroforestry to your operation, especially if you're in an area like some of us find ourselves in the Midwest where there's not a lot of examples of that and folks might not be familiar with those types of practices?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. Some of my thoughts are going in and asking. The more people who go in and ask, even though it's tough to, have somebody say, "I've never heard of that," the more people who go in and ask, the more those local staff are to, share that demand sort of up the leadership, through their networks. And sometimes, those staff then say, reach out to us and ask more, and you're always sort of welcome to say that, talk to the National Agroforestry Center. They're part of NRCS too. Another another sort of thing that I think is important is, every state has a state technical committee for NRCS, and that technical committee sort of offers advice and guidance to the state conservationists on what the important resource concerns are on that state, what the interests are, and those meetings are open to the public. They usually happen quarterly, and so I'd encourage people to attend those meetings and just sort of learn what people are talking about, so that you're able to know what are the resource concerns that my state is really interested in. So if they're more interested, for example, in heat stress than invasive species, maybe you're going to sort of orient your request for assistance that way. And I think, too, getting to know your state-level staff. Sometimes maybe your local staff may not have a lot of familiarity with agroforestry, but if you reach out to your state, and not every state has them, but your NRCS state forester or some of the other staff at the state level, they can sometimes be a useful person to talk with in terms of how to sort of frame your requests and work with folks at a more local level on working on agroforestry. So those are sort of the three recommendations that I make. Go in and have the conversation, even if it's a tough conversation. Participate in and learn more about your state technical committee meetings and get to know your state NRCS staff and talk with them about how to learn more about how agroforestry can be supported by NRCS in your state.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. Joshua asked if I could share a little bit more about how the Savanna Institute is working with NRCS to promote these programs. And we're really excited that we're partnering with Wisconsin NRCS to put on a series of 6 webinars specifically focused on educating NRCS educators and agents on how to talk to farmers about agroforestry and the sort of resources that are available for them in the state of Wisconsin. We're going to be launching that in January, and we'll put information about that on our website. And we're also hoping to replicate that program in Illinois. Folks in Wisconsin are also working on creating more opportunities for farmers and NRCS to share with each other and to create a strong network of support there. So we're hoping to also do that at the Illinois level and then extending out into other states as well.
That's really exciting to hear. We'll be excited to share that through our NRCS networks too.
Hopefully we can, work as we all continue to work together. We'll have this beautiful nationwide network of education and support for farmers, educators, and the greater community as this movement grows. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank Kate again for this phenomenal presentation. I know that I'm going to be sharing much of this with folks that I work with here in Illinois. And I just want to remind folks that we'll be sending out this presentation as well as a link to the YouTube video. And if you, in that email, you'll also get a survey for an evaluation. If you could please take that, it only takes about 2 minutes. And that really helps us create a great future for these nutshell presentations. So Kate, thank you so much again, and thank you to the National Agroforestry Center for all your important work on this movement.
Thanks for all the good questions, and thanks for facilitating.
Okay. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the Perennial Farm Gathering.